The US government shutdown has officially taken effect, viewers, the first since 2019 to be precise, and under US President Donald Trump's second term. Now, this comes after US senators have failed to pass a last-minute bill to, in fact, avert a government shutdown, all but guaranteeing funding will be cut off at midnight. Now, a shutdown brings some but not all US government services to a temporary halt. Services deemed non-essential, which include food assistance programs, federally funded preschools, the issuing of student loans, food inspections, and even operations at national parks will be shut. Meanwhile, we get you this war of words between Democrats and President Donald Trump, followed by a report by my colleague Kate Fisher from Washington, D.C.
Republicans are plunging America into a shutdown, rejecting bipartisan talks, pushing a partisan bill, and risking America's health care, worst of all.
Well, the Democrats want to shut it down, so when you shut it down, you have to do layoffs. So we'd be laying off a lot of people that are going to be very affected, and the Democrats, they're going to be Democrats.
Trump doesn't care about how this shutdown is going to hurt real, average Americans across the country. He doesn't care about the Republican healthcare crisis. He clearly thinks this is all a game.
As you know, no country can afford to pay for illegal immigration health care for everybody that comes into the country, and that's what they're insisting. And obviously, I have an obligation to not accept that. That would affect everybody.
Shutting down the government means hundreds of thousands of government workers are set to be furloughed, that is, sent home without pay, only to be back paid once the government reopens. But US President Trump has threatened to make permanent cuts to the federal workforce, saying of the Democrats that his administration could do irreversible things during a shutdown, quote, like cutting vast numbers of people out, cutting things that they like, cutting programs that they like. Now, 2 unions have already sued the Trump administration over its plans to fire federal workers. And Democrats have brushed off the ultimatum, accusing Republicans of lying about what they are seeking from this legislation. Democrats say they want the bill to include provisions to roll back healthcare cuts that Republicans made over the summer, as well as to extend Obamacare subsidies. But Republicans say those issues can be dealt with after the government has been funded again. Some of the most visible effects of a shutdown will be closures at museums and monuments, and federal workers will see their paychecks stop for the duration of a shutdown, even if they have to stay on the job. And that's workers like active duty troops, air traffic controllers and federal law enforcement officers. The Postal Service, which is self-funded, and Social Security and Medicare benefits, which are considered mandatory spending, should keep on going. Now, who the public sees as being at fault for causing a shutdown could bring pressure to bear on these lawmakers. A recent poll suggests that Republicans would get a larger share of blame for a government shutdown than their Democratic counterparts. That's according to an NPR PBS News Marist research that was released on Tuesday. Kate Fisher, NDTV, Washington.
Shift our focus to Central Asia in Afghanistan, where the country has been plunged into near-total digital darkness. Now, this comes as the Taliban regime has enforced a sweeping internet blackout, essentially cutting off both wired and also mobile services across the country. Now, what began as regional restrictions last month has now escalated into a full-blown nationwide showdown, if we can say so, leaving millions without access to essential online services. Now, the Taliban claim that the move is aimed at curbing vice and preventing what they described as immoral activities. However, viewers, the blackout is severely disrupting daily life, crippling businesses and cutting off vital communication channels. Foreign workers in the United Kingdom will need to wait 10 years instead of the present 5 to qualify for permanent residency, and migrants will need to pass a series of new tests to prove their ability to be a good citizen. The Labour government has announced. Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood has said that people will have to earn the right to claim indefinite leave to remain in the country, which would then allow in turn them the ability to work in the UK and route to a citizenship. Shift our focus to Southeast Asia, where a strong 6.9 magnitude offshore earthquake rocked Philippines, killing at least 69 people with over 140 still injured. As officials warned, the numbers could very well climb further as rescuers access collapsed buildings. The Indian embassy in Manila, meanwhile, has expressed its deepest condolences to the families and loved ones of those affected by this natural calamity in the country. Here are some of the most defining visuals from the earthquake. First up, CCTV footage from Cebu City shows residents panicking as they began to feel the ground shake, as they began to feel the tremors. Some would say sending people dashing out into streets. Moreover, residents also panicked in dark as the intense shaking cut off power supply, with videos also showing structures collapsing altogether and crowds running in fear at a public market. Up next, and a not-so-picturesque ending to the Miss Asia Pacific International 2025. As viral visuals, as you see there on your screens right now, viewers, show chaos and utter chaos at that during the closing gala night of the event. This as panic-gripped models fell off the runway, which began shaking as the 6.9 magnitude quake hit the Philippines. Now, this sent everyone to seek shelter under tables to protect themselves from falling debris in last-ditch effort. Now, one of the contestants, Miss Belgium, also suffered an injury after falling off the runway. And among the many buildings which collapsed includes a centuries-old church as well. That's correct. The Archidocian shrine of Santa Rosa de Lima in Cebu suffered extensive damage. Visual shows piles of debris outside the sanctuary, with large sections of the historic building visibly torn apart. Rubble was also scattered inside the monastery, where properties were destroyed. Built in 1886 for perspective, the shrine was considered the Philippines' first Archidocian church dedicated to Saint Rose of Lima. Meanwhile, my colleague Disha Bagchi joins us for more on this. Disha, at least around 300 people confirmed dead already, hundreds more in need of severe rescue by the teams. What's the latest that you're picking up on ground?
Right. So right now, of course, rescue operations are going on. Officials have said that while so far they have declared 69 people killed in this devastating earthquake, they do expect that this figure is going to increase drastically. Now, because there were multiple buildings, as well as the 100-year-old church that you mentioned, several buildings in fact collapsed. There was quite a lot of damage. The drone visuals we've also received show that massive damage, a lot of commercial buildings collapsing, but this kind of impact and this kind of devastation is quite new to Philippines, even though it does frequently face earthquakes, given the fact that it is in the Pacific Ring of Fire, which is where the two tectonic plates in fact grind. So there's a lot of small earthquakes that do take place in the Philippines. In fact, just earlier this year in January, the Philippines faced two less stronger earthquakes, and there was not a lot of devastation and no casualties. But this one was quite a strong 6.9 magnitude earthquake, which is why the Philippines has seen such large-scale devastation. As you mentioned, so far 69 people killed, 140 injured, but this number is of course going to increase in the days to come as officials continue rescue operations.
And you in fact raised a very important point there, Disha, that the Philippines lies in the Ring of Fire where two tectonic plates meet. And this earthquake, meanwhile, for our viewers' perspective, comes just a day after a hurricane lashed the Philippines, the island country, leaving at least 20 dead. Thank you so much for getting us the latest once again, Disha. Moving on, we shift our focus to Ottawa, where Canada's Foreign Minister Anita Anand is set to visit India on the 13th and the 14th of October, marking a key step in restoring diplomatic ties between New Delhi and Ottawa. Now, the visit comes as an evident sign, viewers, that both nations are in fact ready to re-engage. Now, ahead of a visit by Canadian Foreign Minister, External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar met with her in New York only earlier this week. Over in the Middle East, days after US President Donald Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu agreed to a new US proposal, 20-point proposal Qatar is now holding mediation talks with Hamas leaders along with Egypt, Turkey over the US peace plan, or the 20-point Trump peace plan as it's being called. Meanwhile, the Arab country confirmed that Hamas officials have officially received the full US peace plan and are currently examining it. The plan includes, if Hamas agrees, an immediate ceasefire and the release of all Israeli detainees within 72 hours of the terrorist group. In fact, agreeing to the terms if they choose to do so, if they decide to do so at that. Meanwhile, the death toll in Gaza has reached over 66,000 Palestinians, with nearly 170,000 others wounded. Now, this comes as Israel's military operations in Gaza rage on. Meanwhile, listen in to the Qatar foreign minister.
بالنسبة للوفود الموجودة في الدوحة، شارك رئيس المخابرات المصرية يوم أمس في الاجتماع، وكذلك اليوم من الجانب التركي سيشارك في هذه الاجتماعات مع الوفد التفاوضي لحركة حماس. الاجتماع الذي عقد في نيويورك بين عدد من قادة الدول العربية والإسلامية مع الرئيس الأمريكي وسع دائرة المشاركة.
Stay with the Middle East, where after Syrian government fighters entered the city of Sweda earlier this year in an apparent bid to assert control over the enclave of the Druze minority, leading to Israeli strikes on capital Damascus. Now the Druze groups have in fact set up a de facto military and a governmental body in Sweda, very similar to the Kurdish-led authorities in the country's northeast. Now it is a major setback for Damascus struggling to exert its authority across the country. And of course, this follows a 13-year-long civil war with the support of minorities. This next report explains the details.
When Bashar al-Assad was ousted in an insurgency last year led by Islamist groups, Syria's Druze minority community poured into the streets to celebrate. They had hoped that Syria would become a democracy and that they would establish strong ties with the new rulers in Damascus. But 8 months later, they're back on the streets in the southern province of Sweda calling for self-determination. All their hopes had faded in July when clashes spiraled into targeted sectarian attacks. Rights groups like Amnesty International say that government forces and their allies committed all sorts of atrocities against the Druze minority. And now it appears they're creating an autonomous administration similar to that of the Kurds in northeastern Syria with their own government and military bodies. And another apparent shift among the Druze, many appear to be leaning towards Israel, whose military struck government forces during the clashes and has a sizable Druze community there. Now, Syria's Druze spiritual leader, Sheikh Hikmat al-Hajari, was among a few voices that were skeptical of negotiations with Damascus. But now, he's the most dominant leader there. He set up the Supreme Legal Council, a government-like entity, and managed to band dozens of militias together to form what is called the National Guard, a military-like entity in the southern province.
We now focus on Eurasia, viewers, where Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has warned that the situation at the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station had become critical, with Russian shelling preventing restoration of power needed to cool the reactors and prevent an all-out meltdown. Now, while the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, the UN nuclear watchdog, is working with both sides to restore external power lines, this is the 10th such incident since the start of the Ukraine war back in February 22, when the plant has been disconnected from the power grid. Now, this, of course, increased risks of a nuclear meltdown. Listen in to what the Ukrainian president had to say.
Вже 7-й день, і раніше, до речі, не було такого аварійна ситуація на Запорізькій атомній станції. Ситуація критична. Через російські обстріли станція відключена від живлення, від електромережі. Забезпечується електрикою від дизель-генераторів.
Over to the land down under, where Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese called on China to import Australian iron ore without hindrance. Now, this comes after reports on Wednesday that a state-run Chinese iron ore buyer had told steelmakers and traders to temporarily stop buying shipments from global mining giant BHP. The China Mineral Resources Group company's move against the world's biggest miner based in Melbourne escalates an impasse that contracts negotiations. Albanese has said he was quote-unquote concerned by reports of disruption of Australia's most lucrative export. Here's more.
What we want to make sure is that markets operate properly. And of course, we have seen those issues in the past. I want to see Australian iron ore be able to be exported into China without hindrance. That is important. It makes a major contribution to China's economy, but also to Australia's.
Would that be disappointing considering your recent trip to China?
Well, these measures are always disappointing, but let's hope, certainly, that they are very much short-term.
Thousands of young demonstrators took to the streets of Madagascar's capital, calling for President Andry Rajoelina to step down. Meanwhile, President Rajoelina fired the Prime Minister and the rest of his cabinet along with him on Monday in response to days of deadly Gen Z-led protests which began, in fact, over the failure of electricity and water supply. Essential needs at that. The protesters further had called for the resignation of both Christian Natse and President Rajoelina, but the president gave no indication that he would in fact step down. Shift our focus eastwards now, where China celebrated its 76th National Day today with a grand flag-raising ceremony in the Tiananmen Square at a high-level reception at the Great Hall of People in Beijing. Ahead of a countrywide celebration, Chinese President Xi Jinping issued a sharp warning, or a stark warning, over the issue of Taiwan, essentially saying Beijing must firmly oppose, and I quote him here, external interference and safeguard its territorial integrity. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio extended congratulations, reinstating a once-broken tradition to mark the occasion before October 1 arrives in the United States. Meanwhile, the Shenzhou 20 crew sent videos greeting from space. Over in the U.S., a federal judge has ruled that Trump administration violated the Constitution when it targeted non-U.S. citizens for deportation solely on supporting Palestinians and criticizing Israel. That's a scathing ruling, directly and sharply criticizing President Donald Trump and his policies as serious threats to free speech. U.S. District Judge William Young in Boston agreed with several university associations that the policy they described as ideological deportation violates the First Amendment as well as the Administrative Procedures Act. It's a law governing how federal agencies, in fact, develop and issue regulations. Here's more.
Young held in this decision that the Secretaries of State and Homeland Security intentionally and in concert engaged in a campaign of intimidation, a campaign that involved arresting, detaining, and deporting individuals like Mahmoud Halil, Rumeysa Ozturk, and Mohsen Madawi in order to chill pro-Palestinian speech and speech that is critical of Israel.